Welcome to our What the Media Wants from You session. We will go ahead and get started. I have 12:32 according to my clock here. So let's go ahead and just jump right in. I'm grateful to the folks who have shown up today to be part of our panel discussion on this, and I will introduce them in just a moment here. So the crux of this session is there's a reality of time and other constraints that the media has to operate within. And this session, I hope, will help you understand those constraints. And understanding those constraints, understanding the environment that they're working in, informs the likelihood that your research and your expertise may find wings in the media. So hopefully this will help you better understand their world a bit. And we are grateful to our three panelists, and I'm going to introduce them alphabetically here. Mike Abrams is the Director of Journalism Practices and Principles for the New York Times, which now, according to the numbers I found, has in the neighborhood of 10 million subscribers, which is pretty great. And looking back historically in the heyday of print, this is something like around at least 4 times as many as the most subscribers that the paper had in its very robust print days. So this is certainly a pretty good news for those of us who watch the media and rely upon the media. Mike has been an editor in various roles since 2004. Before that, he worked as a reporter and an editor at newspapers in Pennsylvania and Virginia. And full disclosure, Mike and I, many years ago, worked together at the Virginian Pilot newspaper. It was, I think, 3 kids or mostly for both of us. It's been a long time. He is a journalism graduate of Penn State University, where he's the editor-in-chief of the student newspaper. He lives in Jersey with his wife, 2 kids, and a dog. Next, we have Julia Barajas, who is a reporter for KPCC and LAist. So that's actually a news story in itself. Maybe Julia can explain that to us, because there's a little bit of a transition going on with KPCC. But as a lot of you know, KPCC is among the very top NPR affiliates in the country. The numbers I found, more than 1 million listeners each week. She, from the bio that she provided to me, she reports across beats, including everything from housing to environmental justice. Instead of starting stories by exploring her own questions, she's guided by what readers and listeners want to know. She says her job is to listen carefully to what LAist and ABC readers are curious about, what keeps them up at night, and who they want held accountable. Growing up, Julia spent a good part of the day riding the bus from Southeast LA to the South Bay for school. This served as a daily reminder of the vast disparities between zip codes in the US, especially when it comes to housing, education, recreational spaces, and even the air we breathe. When she's not working, she's often gazing at murals or riding her bike along a river. Julia also enjoys poetry and welcomes invites to poetry readings. I bet you'll have some takers in this group here. And lastly, we have Ashley Hernandez. Ashley is an associate producer for CBS Mornings, a daily news show that draws 3 million viewers. According to the numbers I found, she's a bilingual journalist whose Emmy Award-winning career spans the gamut from field producing to feature writing. She creates compelling, character-driven stories for a daily audience of millions for the national broadcast. She earned degrees in broadcast and digital journalism and Spanish from the University of Southern California. She is also an MBA candidate at Pepperdine University with an emphasis in leadership and management. When she's not traveling nationally or internationally, she volunteers for various causes, including the Make-A-Wish Foundation and the Alzheimer's Association. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. As far as those of you who are listening in, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen where all the other participants chat, or all the other functions are. There's a Q&A button, and if you have questions, feel free to just pop one in there, and then I will either get your questions during our discussion or leave time at the end. I'm going to start off with sort of a quick round robin here. Get to sort of some nuts and bolts of our discussion today. And I'll start with Mike, then go to Julia, and then go to Ashley. As a reporter and as an editor, what traits do the sources on your go-to experts list share? What does one need to do to be on your go-to experts list?
Well, going back a long time, by the way, thank you for having me, John. It's great to be on this panel with other distinguished people in this profession. It's a difficult profession, but I really enjoy it. Going back a long time to when I was a reporter, I think the thing I wanted from sources, I covered education for quite a while, was people who knew things that were going on that weren't widely known, but that were of wide interest. And it takes time to develop that trust, and people are willing to tell a reporter that. So sometimes it would be the people I would see at public meetings or at sporting events for the local schools. And then it would just be that repetition and that conversation. They knew they could trust me, that I would be accurate, but also they had some insight into how things were going. So it wasn't necessarily the people at the top of the organization, but sometimes the people a rung or two or three down who are really doing the kind of like rolling up their sleeves and doing the work to make policy or to make changes. And I think that's one thing I really relied on. And then now for our reporters, I think what they look for are people really making news and who are having impact. So is there research on the cutting edge? Do they have, are they writing books or papers that have been peer reviewed and are standing up to scrutiny? I think that's what we're looking for, because, you know, there are a lot of experts out there, but not all of them are really on the cutting edge or are really offering something that's different from what others are doing. So I think our reporters are constantly looking for that novelty.
Thank you, Mike. Let's jump over to Julia. And again, the question is, how does an expert get on your go-to list?
Thank you so much also for having me. I'm happy to be here. I definitely agree with everything that Mike just shared. One thing that we're doing that maybe other newsrooms are also doing, but at our organization, we're actually keeping track of who we're using as sources, both in terms of like personal, let's say, anecdotes, but also like as experts. And the reason why we're doing that, the reason why I'm mentioning is because we're being very deliberate about making sure that our reporting reflects the people who actually live in Southern California, so that we're not like routinely going to like one segment of the population for whatever. But especially when it comes to experts and in research universities, we're trying really, really hard to make sure that we don't go to the same person every single time. We're also trying to make sure that, again, that like when it comes to diversity, like in terms of like gender, nationality, race, etc., that we're again like trying to really diversify and show that there are experts with a lot of knowledge, that it's not always the same like demographic. So I just wanted to share that because like that's one thing that we're trying to be very intentional about. And one thing that I think that I really appreciate, for example, is I think it's Cal State Long Beach sends me stuff like just like all the time, right? They're just like, here you go, you don't like it, that's fine, I'm just gonna keep sending them. And they also send things like, for example, before the State of the Union, they're like, here are some political experts that can speak to this, and there's 3 of them, and here's what they're doing. And that's really helpful because usually those days they're like, go find an expert, and we're like, all right, we're gonna search for an expert. But if someone's sending them to us, that's super helpful. But I think like what's top of mind for me is really trying to make sure that I'm diversifying, particularly with experts, that I'm not like routinely going to the exact same person who might just be brilliant, but that for 2 reasons. One, if it's a person that's really well known, all the reporters are going to bother that person, right? And they might be like, I can give you 5 minutes or something like that, which is not great. Or 2, that we're just again like going to the same person over and over and missing out on like other insights or other, I don't know, just like difference of opinion or something like that. But yeah, hopefully that's useful.
Thank you. And last, Ashley, how do we get on your go-to experts list? What do we have to do?
Well, working at CBS Network, we're lucky enough to have a team of bookers. So basically, whenever a story breaks or we need a story that's going to be a long form reporting, we'd go ahead and have that team reach out to see who the appropriate expert needs to be. It could be that we're digging into someone's academic work that they really published a paper 8 years ago, but somehow it's not relevant to storyline today. It could be someone that maybe had a comment, or they had a very good, maybe something like this where they were on a panel and they just spoke very eloquently. They were able to deliver a concise narrative or explain something very complicated in a simple way. Also, I think overall, because we have a lot more resources and also we are a TV-driven platform, so you have that media training. You have to understand that we're not out to get you. We need you to sound eloquent, sound like an expert. And if you are not an expert in your field, like no harm, no foul, that's fine. We'll find someone else. But if you are, then fine, then go and talk to us, but also put in that effort and know that, okay, I want to restate that answer I just gave, and it's TV news, but we're network, it's not live. So know that you could restate your answer. You could, reword it in a different way so it's shorter, or maybe you want to elaborate on something. And also we always ask at the end, is there anything else that we didn't cover that you think we should? Because we rely on our expert to explain to us, hey, this is a narrative that you haven't dived into that maybe you're missing because you're on a deadline. And we'll always, I think what's really important is that we'll always tell you when our deadline is. So I'll shoot out an email saying, hey, I need an expert, and we want someone to get back to us saying, okay, we received your email, we're working on this, we'll get back to you. Okay, at least I know that's in the works, versus we don't hear anything at all. I'm like, okay, well, I'm counting UCR out because they haven't even responded to my request. And I don't know behind the scenes you guys are working on this. And then we'd want like maybe a 2-hour window, like, oh, they're free from like 2 to 4. They have office hours, they could do a Zoom meeting. Is that fine? Great. Or I will say, oh, hey, I want some background research on information on so-and-so, can they talk about this? And then this is a long form thing. We'll go shoot it in 3 weeks from now. So there's very different like elements of the timeline that we're working with, but never be afraid to respond to us to ask more questions for more details, because having that always opens a conversation, maybe not this time, but maybe moving forward, because we're always on TV. So we always need more experts.
Thank you. And continuing actually with Ashley, what's your biggest frustration dealing with sources?
I would say one of my biggest frustrations is in the Zoom, in the Zoom world, right? We are able to reach experts more quickly, but they don't have a ring light. They don't understand the idea of framing, when they're in their office. That's very hard because we want to get an interview really quick. And we're reaching out to these experts because we don't doubt you're an expert. You know what you're talking about. You guys are very accomplished in your field. That's never an issue. It's always like trying to find a room or an office that we could clearly see you. We don't want right now, I have a big spotlight on my head, so I look very shiny. This would not be good air quality, right? There's people behind me who could be walking. That's also problematic. Like, we don't want that. Just having media training to be like, okay, can you find a place where your window is like facing you so you have light? Do you look good? Because we always want to make you look good. So sometimes professors or sometimes sources get frustrated because we want them to move, have a certain angle, but we're doing it to make you look good. You already know the content. Now it's just a visual aspect of TV. Everything else is just fine because we will guide you through this. As producers, it's my job to make you look good, make you sound good, and we will not make you look dumb on TV. That is like the opposite of what our end goal is to deliver important story to our team.
And there's somebody walking behind you as you speak.
Exactly. This is a working newsroom. I mean, there's going to be lots of yelling going on.
And I imagine if you had a couple minutes with me before our Zoom interview, you would have said, hey, can you clear some of that stuff away from behind you? Or blur your screen. Great. Julia, the same question to you. What is your biggest frustrations that you deal with in sources working on deadline stories?
I think my biggest frustration honestly comes from, like, with all due respect to like my colleagues from our newsroom, not so much from like the sources, because it'll be like a deadline and we need to have it recorded by, let's say, like noon. And so it could air by like 3 o'clock, and it gives the sources a very tiny window, which I always like apologize for, but it's like, if it's a daily, like honestly, like it's really, we have a very tiny window to get that recorded and get it on air. So that's part of I think my biggest frustration is knowing that I'm being obnoxious and being like, hey, I'm really sorry, but I need this like today. Today is my deadline at this hour, and probably during your lunch break. So there's that. And then the other thing too, it has to do with like sound quality, right? So like a lot of times, but it's just a matter of communicating. People will want to be on speakerphone, or they'll want to be, oh, like, this is the worst one. They'll be like, yeah, we can totally chat. I'm going to be driving. But if you're driving, all that noise is being recorded. So I have to be like, again, really be like, hey, I'm sorry to do this to you, but could you pull over and like roll up your windows in the heat because I need this to be silent. And it has to do with like what our colleague here was saying, that like we want you to sound good. So if there's like competing sounds or cute dogs barking or whatever, that's adorable, like for a podcast, but for like a news segment, it's like, what is that distracting sound in the background? So just, but this is information that I always try to put in there anyway, like please go somewhere quiet, please don't use your speakerphone, please don't be driving. And usually people are like, yeah, but I think it's just a matter of just being like polite and communicating, like, and explaining why we're, kind of torturing you with all these like little expectations.
And Julia, this kind of goes to one of the things I actually wanted to ask you about. The technology has changed tremendously, including in terms of how you conduct your interviews. Even when I started here at UCR less than 7 years ago, anytime we were on with NPR, with an NPR affiliate, we would have to get our expert to go over to our campus radio station where we had an ISDN line, so that the NPR affiliates would pretty much strongly preferred us to do that. That seems to have pretty much gone by the wayside now. Can you tell us now how the way that you conduct interviews for radio has changed in the past few years, and what technology do you use now to conduct interviews with folks, with experts on the fly?
I think you're right. I think particularly during the pandemic, they were like our producers and editors were like, okay, a phone call is fine because people didn't want you understandably in their house, that kind of thing, or their office, for just like safety purposes. But now that it's kind of up and down, but that the pandemic is not as severe and that we do have vaccines available, we are trying to actually do when possible and when time permits, particularly with long form feature stories, to do those in person with our traditional radio equipment. But if it's a quick phone call, what we try to do is there's like levels, but one thing that sometimes happens is that we'll say like, okay, we'll do a Zoom, that's fine, but there'll be a little bit of like graininess. That's not a big deal, but for listeners, it can become that. So what we'll do is we'll have you, for example, like right now we're chit-chatting, and I'll say like, hey, can you please record yourself, John, on your phone? And then when our conversation is over, send that to me. Usually that like works just fine, but sometimes the interviewee might like accidentally not record themselves, or sometimes the interviewee might like really struggle to send like a long conversation because it's a big like a big file, right? So what I try to do is just, when possible, to do it in person, to be honest, just because like stuff happens. And yeah, I don't, does that help?
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, it's changed. Even the way that we help facilitate interviews for TV and for radio has changed a lot in just a few years. And after I get Mike's top frustrations and challenges with sources, I'm going to jump over to Ashley on that same subject of technology. Mike, what would you point to from a print perspective? What would you point to as major frustrations, challenges dealing with sources?
And we don't have a lot of frustrations, but two things that I think can become a challenge would be, one would be, the researcher or the expert often feels really tremendous ownership of that work, and it can be hard to let go. You're one part of the story. Maybe you're the prime part of the story, but there are other voices and other considerations. And it can be hard both during that interview process and then when the piece comes out to see yourself in a sort of smaller context or in a surrounding context. So there can sometimes be frustration with the outcome of that. Also, when you own something and you know it really well, it can be hard to also give up ownership for a broader audience that may not be, that hasn't studied or hasn't done the research to that degree. And a big part of our job is we want to be credible to the experts, but we want to be understood by a really broad cross section of society. And finding that sweet spot is tough. We certainly make mistakes. We will correct them when we do make them, but it can be hard to sort of feel like, well, did my research and work come across to readers? And it can often feel to somebody who really owns it that it didn't. And then the other little frustration that sometimes I have is that now everybody has an outlet, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or TikTok. And that's great because it distributes power to lots of voices. But what can become frustrating, I think, is when experts just take their sort of one note critique of media organizations or society and just sort of puts it out there day after day after day on every single article that's done from their one perspective. And it kind of undercuts the ability to even include that person as an expert if they've just kind of gone on the record and become something of a one-issue advocate. That's great, again, to be a one-issue advocate. I'm not putting that down. But if you want to be a source in sort of what I would call like mainstream news coverage, then it becomes harder when you're known only as an advocate for one issue.
You touched on something that's really goes to the core of researchers, academics' concerns when they deal with the media, and that is there's always often expressed to us a concern of oversimplification of their research in order to make it digestible to a lay audience. How does the Times navigate the line between comprehension to your readership and accuracy, and how can researchers, how can academics help you with that?
Yeah, well, first off, I mean, I think we never want to simplify something to the point where we've lost the thread of what it's about. I mean, we want it to be accurate. I know a lot of our reporters, particularly in technical areas, science, health, will often go over a subject with the source on the phone or in person and say, hey, did I get this right? Did I describe this process correctly? And if they're confused, we tell people there's no such thing as a stupid question. Ask, hey, I'm not understanding this. Can you explain this to me like I'm a third grader? I would much rather have the expert explain it in those terms and to work with that person to clarify things. And then the other thing we do is hopefully you're talking to a range of experts. There may be people with a different view, and you may be able to kind of triangulate a subject to get several different views and then kind of write that as a consensus view. Sometimes we get it wrong and we do have to correct things. I think, though, it is that sweet spot. You're looking for something that sounds smart and is also accurate, but doesn't sound so smart that people feel like, they're just scratching their heads and having to run for a reference book to look it up.
Ashley, jumping back to the technology issue, as you referenced, the way that you conduct interviews and the way that we help facilitate those interviews for researchers has changed a great deal in a short period of time. I think back about even 3 or 4 years ago when someone mentioned about having to facilitate a Zoom interview, we all put our heads in our hands and we were like, oh God, the Zoom thing, who knows how to make Zoom work? And it was all, instruction manuals and everything else. And now, of course, we use it with great ease. Can you talk at all about, Ashley, from the perspective of what's the evolution in how you interview people? For instance, I know not long ago with affiliates, we were always asked, they always wanted to get somebody on camera live on campus And now that's largely gone away. From a perspective of a network program, what's the evolution been in how you interview people in studio, live on camera, Zoom?
I mean, like I mentioned before, it runs a gamut on what the story is, what our deadline is. I mean, it depends if we're, sorry, give me one moment.
And she's in a live newsroom here, folks. You're getting ready to see the news.
Thank you. So like I was saying before, so I think the thing about network is that when we go ahead and depending on the story that we're at, what really matters is that how much time we have. So if we're here I'm based in here in Studio States, to drive all the way down to UCR is going to be very time sensitive. And considering we have maybe other places to go, other things to shoot, like are we going to have the time for that to drive there? I think another thing that you have to keep in mind is that when is the story airing? So it could be a long form story, and we could send a whole camera crew. We're gonna have maybe a 3-camera shoot, a wide shot of the correspondent and the and then the interview subject, and then a shot on only the expert, and then a shot only on the correspondent, and then we do a back and forth. Then we'll have another shot of them walking, to their office and to do some B-roll, like all these things, right? So these depends also on the budget, depends on the story in itself. And then sometimes we, maybe an earthquake hit and there was a fault line that was discovered, by, Riverside, and you have an expert there who could talk about that and how this specifically affects the community there. And maybe because of some redlining, it specifically affects the minority community there. Like that is very specific to UCR. And that is where we would be like, okay, we need this on Zoom because we have to do some other like earthquake coverage throughout the state. So it just depends. And we always want the highest quality, like everyone was saying, we always want the highest quality version of what we can get. But sometimes we are just short-staffed or there's just a lot going on. But I think the best thing you could do is ask, when is this due? What's your deadline? And then work with us and just be open about what you can and can't do. Because sometimes we'll have a team sent out there, and then the person that we're interviewing only has maybe 45 minutes to talk, but it takes us 2 hours to set up a shot and make you look good. Like this is a network crew. So we're sending out 5 people, a bunch of equipment. So if you don't have the time, then let us know, I can't do that, but is a Zoom thing okay? Or can we do this later? And then if you are doing Zoom, please connect to good internet. So many times we'll be interviewing someone and and this is like your bandwidth is low and it'll drop. And we have to redo the interview all over again because they get pixelated. I am here to make you look good on TV. And if you do not look good, I will refuse to let you continue talking. I will interrupt you and say, we have to fix this because we are not going to make bad TV on here. That's my job, to make everyone look good.
And I want to say too, take a moment to say in the Q&A, folks, if you can, to the extent, we appreciate the extent to which you can gear your questions toward the panelists here. And so questions having to do with the dynamics of breaking news and getting experts on deadline. Some of the questions we've got, I'll be glad to answer, but we'll probably answer them offline privately later because they're more geared toward the public information officers. Here.
I could actually answer that second question when it comes to confidential information. You should never tell any confidential information to us when we start our interview. You could say, oh, maybe I misstated or I misspoke and I want to re-say that sentence. But confidential information should not be on your mind, because the second we go and have this interview start, like we are a source, we are gathering information from you. So for you to give us information and say, oh, sorry, I'm not supposed to tell you that, that's very unprofessional and that is not good form. So just clear all of what you're not supposed to talk about from your mind. If you want to, clear up your language vocabulary and how you want to explain things, that makes sense. But other than that, like that's how we work.
Yeah, I see here the question was during restating an answer, do we as experts have any recourse? It says for the file which captured the earlier answer. So thank you for grabbing that one, Ashley. Let me ask you then, Mike, how does the Times view, there's different terms used, background, someone might say, I'm speaking on background here. Sometimes there is information that you can share that you don't want, that you, for one reason or another, professional considerations, you can't go on the record for? Is there an appropriate way to frame that information?
A great question. I think we try to operate from the assumption that nobody understands what any of these terms mean, including people who have talked to reporters for many years. So we always encourage our reporters to be really clear with the people they're talking with. Hey, are we talking about this on the record for publication? Like starting there. We like to start as many conversations as possible there. There are some source relationships where people will just talk confidentially, but we want that conversation to be clear on the front end. And we encourage our reporters to push sources to go on the record to say, okay, you said this to me. Can I use this to confirm it somewhere else? Or can you confirm any piece of this for me? I think the one thing that does irritate reporters is when someone who knows how to work with the press changes their mind after the conversation or says that was off the record. That's not good. If you know, and you've had lots of dealings with reporters, I would encourage you to assume, even if you haven't had the discussion, that what they're expecting is that you are giving them comments for the record to be quoted. And that unless otherwise stated, it's not a best practice. We want people to be open about it, but the idea of asking after the fact to take it off the record, we don't like. And then the one other thing I would say about that is that the less experienced someone is in talking with the press, the more forgiving we tend to be. You know, if it's just somebody on the street who doesn't really know how it works, we really try to be understanding, explain the process, and to make sure they're comfortable with that. That doesn't mean we want to treat experts like garbage. We do not want to do that, but we do expect a little bit more savvy from people who have dealt with reporters before.
Every reporter has their stories about having conducted a long interview at the end of which somebody says, "Oh, I didn't know we were doing this on the record." That's pretty devastating in your reporters. So yes, absolutely. If you're being interviewed, assume this is not on background, that this is information that will be used on the record, and clarify if there is information you want to give as you think might be helpful only as background. Clarify up front with the reporter that that's what you're getting ready to do, and see what their guidelines are for that, because some reporters don't want everything on the record. They don't want anything on background. And so actually I'll throw that to you, Julia, about how do you prefer, if someone has information that they don't want to go on the record about, how do you prefer they frame that information to you or approach you about that?
That's a good question. I think having like a conversation before, I will always ask for permission to, okay, I have to by law, but also like just out of respect, to ask people before I record anything. So some people just want to talk without me recording anything. If I can only take notes, I'm very, I walk kind of people through like what I'm going to do and what I'm going to use it for. But yeah, kind of like what Mike was saying, if I'm interviewing, let's say a politician versus a survivor of sexual assault, it's going to have a very different thing, right? Like if you're a public servant, you owe the public an explanation for whatever topic we're talking about. If you're a survivor of, any kind of violence, like we have to be very careful that we don't like re-traumatize the person, etc. But I'm sure that it is something you guys already know. But for experts who work for universities, the reality is like you also have like bills to pay, families to like, feed and stuff like that. So if you know that there's something that you're going to share that could become a problem for you, like just let me know, and you can say like, I can offer this information, but I cannot be quoted directly, and like Mike was saying, like even people who are, geniuses and experts with PhDs might not be super media savvy. So if you have any questions and you're feeling, I don't know, like a little scared, just feel free to ask that journalist, like, that you're giving the journalist your time for free. So you can be like, hey, can you explain what you mean by that? Just like, be vocal about like your needs and the fact that if you're sharing information that cannot be attributed to you, like as long as like, you're like 2 hours later, be like, oh, actually, put that off. That's very different from like from the get-go, like being clear about, I have something important to share, the public deserves to know, but that like you know, I could lose my job if I share that with you. I will definitely like have respect and listen to that.
One thing occurs to me is that perhaps as public information officers, we don't do a good enough job of educating the media about is that there is, in our world, there's a big distinction between, for instance, administration, staff, and faculty. Faculty certainly have professional considerations when they're talking about issues, but there is academic freedom, and in universities, you're certainly, you know, faculty should not be made to feel like they are at any point, you know, being sort of policed on what they say to the media, and so that's a big difference in terms of if you're the budget director at a university, or the head of business services, or the head of student affairs, or whatnot. There's you operate in a much different world. So that's something I think, you know, that we should explore ways to make reporters more aware of, because issues that can be difficult for someone in administration to talk about, someone on the faculty can speak very, you know, can feel free to speak much more openly about, you know, times. Ashley, I wanted to get back to something you had said earlier. You referenced looking at videos to see how well someone presents on camera. And I know, Julia, you do a version of that, of course, in terms of hearing how people will present. One of the things we think about in our world is, to what extent should we try to help set the table for that? Is it helpful for you on TV, Ashley, and I'll say Julia, in terms of on radio? Do you want to get an MP3, or do you want to get a short video clip? Should we bother shooting videos of our experts talking about their subject? Is that helpful to you in lieu of actually having a media clip? If we have a media clip from another outlet, should we
if you have a media clip from another outlet, that's totally fine. So that way we know, okay, they have that experience, you know, they know like how to face the camera, you know how to address the camera. If you don't have that, that's totally fine. There's always a first time for everything. And most of the time we'll say, oh, that was really great, thank you. We'll always usually have a pre-interview. Like I keep saying, I want to iterate to everyone. I know it's TV, it's network, we have a lot of cameras. We're not here to make you look bad. So we'll always be like, okay, we suggest you turn this way. We suggest you like speak more slowly, or do you want to reiterate this that may have sounded a little convoluted? We will guide you through that. And that will just be your first step into being like, you know, a network resource. If you haven't done it before, it doesn't mean you can't get into it. It's totally fine. It happens all the time. And we'll have you on speed dials. Oh, this is great. You know, so-and-so did great on this topic. Maybe they could pivot to this other topic in this other, you know, for another show, right? We don't want too much repetition within our experts. But overall, I think when you're talking, don't think about talking to the camera or talking to millions. Think about you're trying to explain something to a group of very interested, you know, members of this like group, right? You really want to care about the topic you have. When people care about their topic, when they have strong feelings about it, it comes through TV. And when we're talking about media presence, we don't talk about how they look, you know, do they have veneers on? We think about, are you passionate about whatever you're talking about? And can you convey that passion through a screen to, you know, a national audience? And that is what people could really pick up of their characteristics, their persona, you know, their mannerism. That makes us all human. And that's what makes a really good story. And you could tell it in people's voice and also on radio. You could tell when people really care about what they're trying to deliver.
Thank you. And I know we're, believe it or not, and I don't believe it, we're actually, it looks like we're getting close to time. I think we're in the event that we get suddenly cut off at 1:15. I do have a question here. Actually, I'd like to ask Mike that was in the chat. But I just want to thank the Center for Ideas in Society and Catherine Henshaw for facilitating this and publicizing it, and Sandra Martinez and my group. And I really want to thank these panelists today. Thank you so much. This has been a great discussion. I wish we had another 45 minutes, but you probably don't, because you've got to cut out a product. I'm going to jump over to a question here for Mike. It says, in writing an op-ed, do you have advice on how to know it's ready, like when I should send it to the Times. Should I more or less when I'm submitting? And it says, and do submissions without a contact have a much lower chance. So let's just focus on the first part of that. More or less when you're submitting an op-ed.
Well, first of all, it's really hard to get an op-ed. We now call them guest essays, in case you're wondering. We feel like readers might know more about what that means. It's really hard. It's almost like a lottery ticket. I mean, there are thousands of these submissions every year. So it's hard. I mean, our editors look at as many of them as they can. I would say it should be camera ready. I mean, it's not going to be camera ready. I think one thing that a lot of people don't know is that, you submit this thing, you think, oh, my words are going to appear in the Times. There's a pretty rigorous editing process involved with that. So one, you want it to be what you think is camera ready. So have others read it for you and feel really good about it. But then kind of know that the editor working on it with you may have suggestions for you and hope that there's a pretty vigorous back and forth, just as there would be in an academic setting. I think definitely include contact information, because if your ticket is pulled and you win the lottery, then you're going to want to be accessible both right away and then also for edits. I think the kinds of things that help, if you're a really known expert on something, if you have something new to say on a subject, and if it's timely, if there's a debate going on in society and this angle hasn't been written, that's what people want.
Ashley had to head out, as we could tell, so it's a busy day there in the newsroom. I was wrong. We do have another 15 minutes, thankfully, so we've got a few more minutes to go here. And actually, I'll put this to both of you. Another good question in the Q&A here is it okay to ask a reporter questions about the goals of the piece? Mike, do you want to handle that first?
Yeah, I think that's fair to ask a reporter. I mean, we certainly wouldn't share the fully written article with someone before publication, but I think it's fair to say, hey, what is this about? What is the angle here? And a reporter should be honest about, hey, I'm investigating this issue, I'm looking into this subject, and I'm looking for an expert perspective on it. If a reporter is reluctant to share that with you, then that would make me nervous. You want to have an upfront, honest dealing with reporters. So I think you're entitled to that. And it's a good question to ask.
And Julia, how would you answer that? Is it okay to ask you ahead of time about the goals of the piece you're working on?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I'll probably say like, oh, our goal is to inform the public. But I think to say like, what's the angle you're taking, that's completely fair. And yeah, we can't share like here's the article for you to proofread and approve or anything like that. That's not something we do. But I have nothing against like sharing the quote that I'm using so that you feel good about, what's being published and attributed to your name. I think that's completely fair, and that's not something that I shy away from. But I honestly kind of like what Mike was saying, like, I don't want there to be any surprises or anything that was unethical. So if there are any changes, that let's say my editor was like, we started with this angle and now we're doing a little bit more of this, I will go back and be like, hey, like, we're actually doing this now. We took it in a different direction. Do you still feel comfortable being part of this story? And if someone tells me no, then I lose that source, and that's okay. But the last thing I want, I think what Ashley was saying, like, we want you to look good, sound like an expert, because you're doing me a favor at the end of the day, by sharing your expertise. So yes, I think that's completely fair and okay. But yeah, we definitely can give you the article to proofread and approve of.
Yeah, and that's actually that becomes sort of, is journalism 101 for a lot of folks. And the person who asked the question obviously knows the way that it was framed, knows that we don't ask the journalists to see the article ahead of publication. And it's something as a journalist that one really sort of blanches at when you're asked about it. But from the academic's perspective, you're probably going to hear you're going to inevitably hear, particularly if you're writing about a very complex subject, a pretty earnest question, which is, hey, this is really technical. Can I see what you got before you publish it? So is there any happy medium there?
I think something Julia said that, reading back quotes, reading back a technical explanation of something. I think those are definitely steps that we take, and we, especially if it's a really technical subject, reading it back, making sure you've got it right. I don't think we're doing that to have the source edit the tone of the piece. We want it to be accurate, and we want it to have the right context and the right weight. So I think, to me, that feels like the middle ground. Does that feel like a middle ground to you, John?
Yeah. Yeah, I know that in the past when I was a reporter, I wouldn't hesitate myself to read back. I don't know if I would paste and copy, but a portion that was strictly, a factual portion, I wouldn't hesitate to do that, because as the writer, you're it's good for academics to know that reputable reporters are as worried or more worried about misrepresenting the facts in their story, and a lot of in a good newsroom, it's a punitive kind of thing if you get it wrong. I remember at the Virginian Pilot, I don't know if you remember this, Mike, but they used to publish a list of factual of mistakes, published corrections, and posted it on a board in the downtown newsroom. And so you did not want to be the person on the top of that list. So yes, there's a great impetus to get it right in the reporting side as well. Julia, I'd like to speak a little bit to the sort of nitty-gritty of getting a story, of the process by which a story sees the light of day. Let me ask you, as at KPCC, do you more often pitch stories to your editors, or do editors assign them to you?
I think, by and large, I can speak for myself, and even conversations I've had with most of my colleagues, it's like 75% we pitch and 25% things that our editors assign us. Usually we'll get assigned like dailies, that kind of thing, but when it's like enterprise stuff, it's usually something that we come up with. So there's that. And then was your other question like, how can we make sure that, or like, how can we help stories see the light of day kind of thing?
Yeah.
That is a good question, because yeah, when we get a pitch, then we have to pitch it, right? It's like I mean, I've had stories I thought were awesome, and then I share them and then they get rejected. But I will also say that if I really believe in a story, I'm not obnoxious about it. I'm respectful of my editor, but I'll be like, hey, I really think we should give it a whirl or reconsider it. And then same thing, like, let's say you pitch a story and you get no response, but you think it's really important. Like, I would say, like, don't give up on it, because you're probably right. There's probably a reason for that. I think it also really helps to pitch it to the right people. I think all reporters get like random pitches. You're like, why did you send me this? Like, I don't even cover this. So like, make sure it's like the right beat. That's very basic stuff. But if it's yeah, just make sure you're sending it to the right reporter, because that'll save you time. That's one thing. And then two, I think Mike talked about this earlier. Like, if it's something like, is there like research on the cutting edge, particularly if you're about to publish something, the more time you can give me ahead of time, so I can read it, because I really don't like just like quoting a little piece of an article I've never read. Like, I like to read the articles, or I like to read the books. So the more time you can give me to actually like, read your work and understand it is very helpful. Let me know if that answer was sufficient, or if I.
No, that's great. And this is a dynamic that a lot of people are not really aware of, and that is the fact that we pitch the story to you, but then that's just half the battle. Then you in turn have to be able to frame it to your editor to get the green light on it a lot of times. So can you think of when you go to an editor with a story, what are the kinds of questions that an editor, I'll ask you, Julia, and then I'll ask Mike from the editor perspective. What kind of questions are you likely to hear when you pitch a story to them? When they're kind of quizzing you, or trying to find out whether they're questioning your reasoning behind pursuing this story, what kind of questions are you going to hear? You're muted.
Thank you. Because we're in Southern California, the first thing they'll ask me, like, what it's like is there a local angle, right? Like if it's more of a national thing, that'll be more of an NPR story. So is there a local angle? And if it's like something interesting, but like what are the implications? Like, does it actually impact people, or is it more like a slice of life story? Right. That's the thing. One story that I know gets like constantly rejected that I don't expect to come from you, but just I'll put it out there as an example of things that get rejected, of things that are going to happen but haven't been confirmed. So let's say like, oh, we're planning to file a lawsuit. If you haven't filed it yet, like, or it's not happening today, like we're not going to write about how you're thinking of possibly filing a lawsuit, or you might build something. Like there has to be like something actually happening. And then another thing that that I get asked a lot is like to go to the people who are closest to the issue. So for example, I recently did something about like when we count people who are experiencing homelessness. And so understandably, like people want to give you like the experts or like the people who organize at the event. But at our station, we really try to interview people who, for example, in this case would be unhoused, or like maybe the volunteers at the homeless count. More so than like the politicians who showed up. Like, that's nice, like that you showed up to count, like, but that's, you know, part of being a public servant. So yeah, I think to properly answer your question, we look for local angles, wider implications. So for example, for something really interesting happening at UCR, could it be of interest to people in other parts of Southern California?
Super, thank you. That's a great answer. Mike, from the editor's perspective, if a story doesn't automatically hit you right away as a home run story, and what kind of questions are you going to ask to in the interest of sort of getting the reporter to justify this?
I mean, I think it's not much different from the local, you know, angle. I think the difference just being, we want to know, like, why is this a story today? Who does it affect? Why is it important? Will it resonate broadly with people, or is there something at a local level that has broader implications? I think Julia said the same thing, broader implications for people all over the world. It's kind of like, to me, you know, the news business is more art than science. You kind of know it when you see it. You know, oh, that's a good story. And you kind of know when something isn't. If it's really, especially if it's really interesting to the researcher, but has been done, or there are 50 books that have been put out in the last 3 years, may not be news. There's a question, by the way, here about, this feels like maybe a question for you, John, but how people can make themselves available to us.
Yeah, and we're glad we have the university relations group, and so we have our research writers who live within this group, and you can feel free to just to send a message to me, john.warren@ucr.edu, and I'll connect you with your individual who covers your school or college. So yeah, it would always, we try to on our own independently canvas and see what research is out there. We have different searches set up. We're checking your websites, your lab sites. We're pestering you with emails periodically to try to find out. But the best way we can find out is if a researcher specific to the journal publication process. The best way we can find out is if the researcher will send us a message when an article has been published has been accepted for publication before it's been published, because that gives us a little leeway to get out there with it. Here's Julia, a question for you that I have. One of the challenges that we deal with in public information is that reporters will be on a deadline story and they'll reach out for an expert. There's a sense that since it's not specific to UCR, you're probably reaching out to other experts simultaneously. So how is that true? First of all, is that when you're going for a story, if you've got, I don't know, earthquake or wildfire or Supreme Court decision, and you're looking for experts, are you going to, how broad are you going, how wide are you going to cast your net for experts?
I'll be very specific. I like for a daily story, like we'll start the day at like 8:30, 9 o'clock, and they'll be like, I need this in by like the afternoon, right? So when it's like desperate times, I'll probably reach out to 3 people, and the first one to respond will be the one I usually interview. And then the other 2 will be like, oh, thank you so much. But you know, I already got somebody else signed up. It doesn't mean like, you know, I know that people like, it's just like Fridays for example, are like super tough because people are like, what, like, who are you, kind of thing. But yeah, unfortunately, that's how fast it moves, like, because it needs to be like we need the interview done, filed, and it has to be edited, and then it gets like ready for like to be aired. So it's just like very, very fast. So yeah, we do reach out to multiple sources.
Thank you. We're almost at time, and I want to thank both of you again. I want to thank Ashley. We do have time for one sort of less of a nuts and bolts question, but that I'd be interested in hearing one or both of your opinions on. I'll start with Mike. Mike, has the value of facts changed in our society? And what does that mean to academics and researchers?
Well, I think the problem now is that facts probably become more important, but harder to figure out. And also, you know, with the emergence of AI that can't distinguish between credible information and disinformation, I think is a real challenge. So to me, they become more important. And I think it means we have to be transparent about our work. Where did the information come from? How did we verify it? And when we got it wrong, we have to correct it. A lot of people say, oh, you know, the New York Times gets lots of things wrong. Look at all those corrections you publish. You must be ashamed of that. And I actually like to say that that's a badge of honor that we publish a lot of corrections. Not that we're making all those mistakes, but that we're being honest about when we do make mistakes, and we're putting them right out there and we're correcting them. To me, that's the only way you can kind of fight that disinformation, is to say, okay, we got this wrong, or we misunderstood this, and here's the correct information. And it's dangerous, though, I think, where we're heading right now.
Well, it really is. And again, speaking to the dynamics of the newsroom, it's a courageous thing as a reporter to own up to, you know, to something that could be a correction, or it really could be more of a clarification. It could be that, you know, you did your best to frame it correctly, but people misunderstood. In a newsroom environment, that's a big deal. You know, you don't, it's falling on your sword, and no one likes to do that. And you know, there's a price to pay for that. So it really is it really does require some courage. So I very much to your point, Mike. And Julia, what do you have anything to say on that front in terms of, do you think that the value of facts in your world, do you see a change in terms of that? Does that make you want to go more readily to people like academics who are going to give you information based on research, based on fact?
I think like when Mike said that facts are probably like as important and becoming more so just because of the climate that we're in. But I always think of, there are times when like a sentence on the article will be like 2 days of reporting, because that's how much it matters to us to get it right. And yeah, like when we issue a correction or clarification, we're usually like, we got it wrong, and it's like not a great day as a reporter, because you do your best to do that. But like what matters most is like, otherwise it's fiction, right? Like if it's inaccurate, it's fiction. So I don't have anything like super insightful to add. It's just that it's incredibly important, and we work really hard to get it right. And when we get it wrong, I immediately own up to it. There's like no time to waste in terms of like owning up to an error. And then 2, just like, because like, since we're an online only, like it's not like it's out there and it's being disseminated incorrectly. So it needs to be fixed immediately. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Well, we are at time. I just want to say again, thank you to Mike and Julio and Ashley, and thank you to Catherine for facilitating and Sandra for facilitating. I really enjoyed this discussion. I learned some things.